Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday. I pray you put me...
All right, boys and girls, we have finally come to the last day of the Wednesday Wars. Whew. So much has happened in this book, and we're finally going to wrap things up. So the questions that you want to ask during this last reading is, what are the stories that still are left to tell? What are the questions that you haven't had answered, that you need to have answered? Every book doesn't answer every question, because sometimes we have to answer those questions ourselves. If you go back a couple of sections ago, Holling and Mrs. Baker were sitting in that church, and Mrs. Baker was talking to him about two things, and she told us the one, and she never told us the second. And again, I think that there are things in stories that are better left unsaid. And as frustrating as that is, as readers, sometimes we have to answer the questions ourselves. Holling, is in 7th grade, and he's still learning how to be a 7th grader, let alone not an adult necessarily, but growing up. Like when you get to 7th or 8th grade, you start maturing a little bit. You stop being just a kid. You start being a teenager and heading towards being a young man or a young lady. And you can see all of these characters are dealing with that, this coming of age story. It was about as far away from the perfect house that you can get and still be in the same universe. We probably would have stayed there all night if it hadn't started to rain. Actually, started isn't really the right word. It didn't come on like rain usually does, a little at a time, until you first realize that you're feeling a drop or two, and then you realize it's more than a drop or two, and then you know you need to get someplace because it's going to really come down in a minute. Here, 1 second, it was all ascending sparks, and the next it was all rain. It must have been something like the moment the doors closed on Noah's Ark. We threw our wool blankets over our heads, but it was already too late. We held the blankets tight around us as cold wind dropped down with the rain, and while every single 7th grader from Mrs. Baker's class was hollering and trying to keep already soggy sleeping bags from getting a whole lot soggier and asking if snakes came out in the rain, Danny and I loaded more wood onto the fire to keep it from going out. And that's pretty much what we all did for the rest of the night. Hollered and wrung out sleeping bags and kept throwing wood onto the fire, except for Mrs. Baker, who went inside the tent with Mrs. Sidman. When dawn finally came, which we were all ready for, let me tell you, every bit of ground around the campsite was wet. Every bit. Puddles everywhere. It squelched while we walked, though sometimes it was hard to tell. Sometimes it might have been our sneakers squelching. Mrs. Baker came out of the tent and looked at us with half-closed eyes. "Awfully soggy, isn't it?" she said. "Why is it that when teachers go on campouts, they have tents?" Mrs. Sidman came out with a dark green poncho that covered her head and reached down to her ankles. She looked around the miserable campsite. We all had mud up to our knees, and most of us had draped our sleeping bags on pine branches above us. Water dripped from their corners. "You look like refugees," she said. "Perhaps we should move toward breakfast," said Mrs. Baker. Mrs. Sidman nodded. "You used a lot of wood last night," she told us. "I'll find the eggs," said Mrs. Baker. That morning, we had scrambled eggs spiced with pine bark, which came from the sticks we used to stir them. The orange Kool-Aid we drank was muddy because the rain had stirred up the river before we filled our jugs. The bread was soggy, so we dripped honey onto the slices and rolled them, and they didn't taste too bad. Mrs. Sidman warmed the rest of the chili over the fire again in case anyone wanted it. Only Doug Switek did, which was a mistake as it turned out. I think if it had kept on raining, we would all have gotten in under Mrs. Sidman's poncho and walked back home. But after Marilee and I had carried all the pots to the stream, we waded right on in with them since we were wet through already. The clouds started to shred and sunbeams slit through. Each beam stabbed at the cold winds until one by one they whimpered and died. The whole sky grew yellow and we threw off the wet blankets. Nothing smells worse than a wet woolen blanket. And then squelched around the campsite, gathering more wood for the day, until suddenly it was so warm that someone said, "Let's go swimming." And we all ran a little way down the paths to the latrines and put on shorts and came back to the water and stepped carefully in. It was still cold, until Danley finally let himself slide down with the high current and over the waterfall ledge and into the pool. When he surfaced, he was laughing and snorting with water up his nose. "It's great," he said, and so we all went over the waterfall and got water up our noses. Even Marilee. Even my tea, holding Marilee's hand. That's what we did most of the morning while Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Sidman stood above us and watched. I could tell that Mrs. Baker was wanting to try it. It was probably getting hot on the open rocks above the falls, with the sun coming straight down now. Everything in the woods around us was steaming and glistening. The ferns, the pines, the leaves, the moss, everything, even the teachers. It's got to be hard to be a teacher all the time and not jump into a pool of clear water and come up laughing and snorting with water up your nose. We do it anyways. We ate lunch, chicken salad sandwiches and cucumber spears, which didn't need utensils, and then we headed back to the water, where Danny was throwing dives that the rest of us tried to match but couldn't. He could flip 1.5 times and land headfirst right where the falls hit the pool, disappearing in white spray. Once he got around 2 full turns, which no human being should be able to do, and came up laughing and snorting so hard he could hardly breathe. That's all we did most of the afternoon. Not a diagrammed sentence in sight, swimming and diving in a waterfall through the heated hours, until finally we came back up the campsite and Mrs. Baker started to assign our chores. Now, you have to understand that we'd been here for a day and a half, and in all that time, Doug Switek hadn't followed the gentleman's sign and used what was over the 2 ridges. He hadn't gone to the bathroom. It was pretty clear he wanted to. Actually, it was very clear he wanted to, but he wasn't going to use a hole in the middle of the woods, he said, even if he had dug it himself. Still, when you've eaten chili the night before, and chili for breakfast, you can't hold it off forever. Even Doug Switek knew that, and that's why he finally gave in. He didn't have any choice. He was gone for a long time. No one said anything, but everyone watched down the path, and no one was surprised when he came back smiling, which you can understand. He probably had no idea what had found him, and what was now following him. Even we couldn't tell. "Looks like smoke," said my tea. "But it's following him," said Danny. Mrs. Baker sighed. "It's not smoke," she said. "It's mosquitoes," I said. Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes. We all ran. Doug Switek couldn't quite figure out why, until the first ones landed on him. He looked down and saw his arms covered. That was until they flew into his eyes. Then he ran too, and probably hit a whole lot more trees than he would have if the world was a fair place. The mosquitoes followed us like little airplanes. Simile. You could hear them buzzing. We ran down to the water and splashed at them. They hovered above us and laughed. Personification. We ran toward the woods and swatted at them with pine branches. They laughed some more. Then we ran toward the fire, since Mrs. Baker said they hated smoke. They don't. Hiding in the smoke helps about as much as scrunching under a desk during an atomic bomb attack. "Keep moving and stay in groups," said Mrs. Baker, which is the same strategy to use if you're floating in the ocean and surrounded by sharks. It means that anyone on the outside of the group gets picked off. So we took turns getting in close to the center, except I gave Marilee my turn, since she had helped me with the pots. She said that I saved her about a pint of blood, which was worth it, the way she smiled at me when she said this. And that's how Mrs. Biggio found us when she hiked in at dusk, all huddled into small groups, swatting hopelessly at hordes, great vocabulary word, of mosquitoes, nothing cooking on the fire. Mrs. Sidman was in the tent, with the entrance zipped up. Mrs. Biggio unslung her backpack, whipped out the can of insect repellent, and went to work on us. Then she loaded wood onto the fire and sent half of us out for more. "The rest of you bring me 3 large flat stones from the river and scrub them clean. And bring back 2 pots of water, too. Who's been cleaning these?" When we came back with the stones and pots of water, she unloaded garlic and carrots and potatoes and turnips and chuck beef and tomatoes. Mighty stared at it all. "Tit beaucoup?" she asked. Mrs. Biggio's making another Vietnamese dish. It will be by the time we're done, said Mrs. Biggio. The curry and ginger root are in the front pocket there. I couldn't find any lemongrass, so we'll have to make do. She and my tea made do. In a little while, the water was boiling, and they had chopped up the potatoes and turnips into one pot, and the chuck beef into another, and then they combined them and added everything else that Mrs. Biggio had brought. And even if there wasn't any lemongrass, it all smelled as wonderful as any food cooked over an open fire can smell, which is pretty wonderful, let me tell you. Just as we saw our first star, Mrs. Biggio and my tea ladled the stew into our bowls along the trail. You can never be too careful about your supplies, she said to Mrs. Sidman, who, because she was eating hot tit beaucoup, was happy enough not to blame anything on me, even though I still was the one who carried the pots down to the stream to clean them out, with Marilee. And neither of us minded at all. We were still there when Mrs. Biggio and my tea came down to wash Mrs. Biggio's cutting knives, which she wouldn't let anyone but my tea touch. And when Mrs. Biggio said to my tea that she had meant to be up to the campsite earlier, but that she had taken the morning to speak with the Catholic Relief Agency that had sponsored my tea when she came from Vietnam. She wanted my tea to know that the house where she was living with the Relief Sisters was very nice, but if she wanted, that is, if my tea would like to, Mrs. Biggio had a small house and she was living all alone now. And she thought that maybe if my tea could ever imagine that, until my tea put her arms around Mrs. Biggio and Mrs. Biggio put her arms around my tea and the ripples of the water replaced all worlds. Good Lord for Alliance. So I'm not going to tell you what happened there. I want you to put it all together. And of course, you can make comments below. Mrs. Biggio was supposed to be there earlier, but she went and she talked to the Catholic Relief Agency. And what did she talk about? And I want you to compare Mrs. Biggio in June to Mrs. Biggio in September, October, and November. And we could make Venn diagrams all over the place, comparing Mrs. Biggio before to Mrs. Biggio after, comparing Mrs. Biggio to my tea. What are their similarities? And what are their differences? That night I lay awake. It seemed that the soggy ground had sunk down and left a whole lot of rocks to poke up into me. I watched the bazillion stars amaze the sky above. I watched until they fell asleep themselves, half my mind on sea, half on shore, thinking about my tea and Mrs. Biggio and Lieutenant Baker coming home to Mrs. Baker, and Danny Hupfer getting ready for his bar mitzvah, and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and how in 5 years I'd have to register for the Vietnam War, and how the dew was starting to soak my sleeping bag. Oh gosh, it gives me chill bumps. So right there, Holling is by himself, looking at these beautiful stars, thinking about all of these things, these big things that are happening right in front of his eyes. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Mrs. Baker's husband was missing for 3 months and is now coming back. My tea and Mrs. Biggio I don't want to say hated each other, but struggled. And now, not so much. This new Holling, who's now realized it's not about me, sees that his future in 5 years, no matter what he does, he's going to be old enough to be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. So I was still awake when the dawn started to think about showing herself. The air was coloring everything gray, and the fog was coming up from the ground in white shreds and billows, as if the whole campsite had lifted itself up into the clouds overnight. I slipped out of my dewy sleeping bag and walked through the white and the gray to the water. When I reached it, the stream rippled happily, as if it had been waiting just for me all this time. I knelt down and lowered my palm into it, cold, frigidly cold, but I rolled up my pants and waded in. Beneath me, the rocks of the stream bed felt smooth and slick, even soft, as the water rushed past, carrying itself away. Then I looked upstream. The disk of the sun had just come up, and the billows of fog had bowed to it, and backed away. The river was a sudden ribbon of silvery light, flickering and sparkling and flashing, carrying the new light on its back all the way down from the high mountains. It was so bright that you couldn't see below the surface until the water was right up to you, and then it was suddenly clear and buoying me up in its rush, and it never stopped. This rush of bright water from the mountains, these flashes and chunks of light from the sun. There was so much of it to come. He's standing there in the water. He wades into the water, and he's standing there looking as the sun comes up, and it's hitting the top of the water just right, and the light is just sparkling off the water. And you've all seen it before, either in pictures or at the peninsula or at any of the streams close to our house or at any river that you've ever gone to. When the sun hits it just right, it makes almost like a mirror, and he's seeing all of these beautiful flashes of light wash over him. And he says, there was so much of it to come, so much of this light to come. So, he sort of was baptized of all of his youth and is now becoming a young man. I didn't tell anyone about the river that morning, not even Merrill Lee. I think that if I had told Pastor McClellan, he would have said it was a vision. I think if I told Mrs. Baker, she would have said that it was a miracle, that all dawns were miracles. Miracles being much on her mind lately, as you can understand. I think that if I had told Shakespeare about the river, he would have said, all this amazement can I quell. I think that if I had told Shakespeare about the river, he would have said, all this amazement can I qualify. But he would have been wrong, since what I saw was something more beautiful than has ever been written. But I didn't tell anyone. Not even Danny, who was hoping for a miracle right up to the day of his bar mitzvah. You could see him waiting for the worst to happen when he stood up in the synagogue a week later. A synagogue that was full mostly with Hupfers. Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Biggio and Mrs. Sidman sat near the front. My T and Merrill Lee and Heather and I sat behind a group of ancient Hupfers. I was trying to keep my borrowed yarmulke on the back of my head because it felt like it was slipping down all the time. And our parents were there too, even my father, who I guess figured that Mr. Hupfer might someday need an architect. And so he had better show up. It was sort of like an investment. He sat as far away from Mr. Kowalski as he could. Never change, never change. We all watched as Danny pulled the prayer shawl his great uncle had given him around his shoulders. The tassels reached below his waist. Then he wound the tefillin around his arm and across his forehead. You could see him still waiting for the worst, hoping for a miracle. Then the prayers, still waiting. Then he walked with the rabbi and cantor back to the altar and took out the Torah. We all stood. I reached up to press down my yarmulke, and he carried the Torah back to the reading desk. The rabbi drew it from the mantle, untied the scroll, and rolled it open. A huge breath from Danny, still waiting. So he's sitting here, and he's still this kid, and he's waiting. Please, something happen so I don't have to do this. But he's been preparing for months. He's been preparing with his family. He's been preparing with his school. He's been preparing with his church. He's been preparing with his friends. And then, can you believe it? The miracle came after all. He lifted one of the tassels, touched it to the scroll, kissed it, took the handles of the Torah in his own hands, and he began to sing. I am not Jewish. I don't know these words, so I'm going to do the best that I can. If you happen to come across this and you are, I apologize. I'm going to do the best that I can. Know that I know I'm just not good at this. Baruch et Adonai HaMevorach. And everyone around us sang back. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Ayolam Vayed. And Danny sang again, deep and steady, until he got to the Baruch Ata Adonai Notayen HaTorah. When everybody sang back, just as deep and just as steady. Amen.
The Torah reader will point to the spot where the reading is to begin. You take your talit and you kiss the spot, And then you recite the refrain and read the Torah portion.
Then Danny took a deep breath and began to read from the Torah. Okay, so maybe sometimes the real world is smiles and miracles. Right there in front of us, Danny Huffer was no longer Danny who stuck wads of gum under his desk, or Danny who screamed out of his skull at soccer games, or Danny who ran cross country on bloody knees and waved sweaty t-shirts. He was more than all of those things. He sang the words, and he was everyone who had sung them before him. Like he was taking up his place in this huge choir. And it wasn't Miss Violet of the very spiky heels, but God himself leading the music. You saw Danny covered with weight. Then the cantor and Danny's father stood over him and blessed him. More weight. And Danny chanted again, this time from the prophets. More weight. And then he reached into his back pocket and took out his speech, his Devar Torah. Today, he said, I am become a man. And he had. You could see it afterward when he recited the blessings over the challah and over the wine, and everyone shouted, L'chaim, to life. Danny had become a man. You could see him take up his place, and he was smiling and crying too. After the service, my parents and Heather decided not to stay for the party already starting in the reception hall. When they asked if I wanted a ride, I told them I would walk home instead. But I went to the parking lot with them anyway. As he unlocked the car, my father said, I bet you're glad you don't have to go through something like that. I guess I am, I said. What do you mean, I guess I am, he said. Would you want to stand up there with all that stuff all over you and chant at everyone? It was a whole lot more than chanting at everyone, I said. Let's get in the car, said my mother. No, said my father. He put his arms up on top of the station wagon's roof. I'd like to know what Holling thought was a whole lot more. My stomach got tight. He became a man, I said. You think that's how you become a man? By chanting a few prayers? You think you become a man by getting a job as an architect. My father straightened. That's exactly how you become a man, he said. You get a good job and you provide for your family. You hang on and you play for keeps. That's how it works. I really do think we should get in the car, said my mother. I don't think so, I said to my father. It's not just about a job, it's more. It has to do with choosing for yourself. And you didn't even have to go to California to figure all that out, said my father. So, who are you, Holling? I felt Heather looking at me. And somehow, I don't know how, I thought of Bobby Kennedy, who could have made all the difference. I don't know yet, I said finally. I'll let you know. What a barrel of mumbo-jumbo, said my father. He got into the station wagon and slammed the door. My mother blew me a kiss, really, and then she got in too. And my sister got in last of all. She was smiling. I could hardly breathe. Ah, he stood up to his father, and Mom, you could tell, like, supported it. And Heather, of course, like, this was the first conversation they had. So, Holling finally did it. You can tell he's changed. And he finally stood up to his father. When they drove away, I went back inside Temple Bethel, where the sounds of the miracle were still loud. Danny was still smiling, and it wasn't just because Mr. Goldman had brought huge trays of brown, light, perfect cream puffs. If you didn't chant that, you need to go back and chant it. He couldn't stop smiling, and after a while I couldn't either, especially once the dancing started and Marilee took my hand, and even more especially after Marilee said, "You look different." And I said, "Yeah, maybe it's the yarmulke." And she said, "No, something else." Marilee, can the world buy such a jewel? Think about how far they've come. And think, like, she can see it. Like, he stood up to his dad. His dad has been such a jerk through this whole thing. Holling, you're this. Heather, you're this. It was when I had gone to find her a Coke that I saw Mrs. Baker standing alone beside a pile of sugared strawberries. She was holding one in her hand, smiling too. Now, I know that you're not supposed to talk to a teacher outside of school activities. It's a rule that probably no one has ever broken, but I decided to break it anyway. It's not a rule. You can talk to me anytime. Do you think Lieutenant Baker will really be home in time for strawberries? I said. Mrs. Baker, smiling Mrs. Baker, did not look away from the strawberry. I'm sure of it, she said. Now I smiled. Do teachers always know the future? Always, she said. Shall I tell you yours? Standing there in the music of the bar mitzvah party, feeling the weight of what had happened in the synagogue, I saw again the glittering stream with its light rushing toward me. Don't tell me, I said. But how do you know? She looked away from the strawberry and at me. Do you remember Don Pedro standing alone at the end of the play? I nodded. Claudio has Hero, and they'll be fine. Benedict has Beatrice, and they'll be fine. Everyone else has everyone else, and they'll all be fine. The only one who's left alone is Don Pedro, and they all go off to dance and leave him behind. And they don't even remember that he's the one who has to deal with the traitor tomorrow, or that he hasn't got anyone. That's right, said Mrs. Baker. And maybe his whole country will split into pieces. He doesn't have any idea what's going to happen to him. Great comedy, I said. A comedy isn't about being funny, said Mrs. Baker. We've talked about this before. A comedy is about characters who dare to know that they may choose a happy ending after all. That's how I know. Suppose you can't see it. That's the daring part, said Mrs. Baker. So, you think Don Pedro ended up all right, I said? I think he became a man who brought peace and wisdom to his world because he knew about war and folly. I think that he loved greatly because he had seen what lost love is. And I think he came to know, too, that he was loved greatly. She looked at the strawberry in her hands. But I thought you didn't want me to tell you your future. So he read Much Ado About Nothing, and we haven't really talked about it at all in this book. And then she talks about this character, Don Pedro. He's this character who's left with this unknown future at the end. And she talks about how the future is in his hands and that he's a good person and a good man. And it turns out she wasn't talking about Don Pedro at all, even though she was. She was talking about Holly. The music started again, a quick ring dance. Danny Huffer was going to dance with Mrs. Biggio, and my tea was doubled over, laughing. Mrs. Sidman had stepped into the ring beside Doug Switek, who didn't look all that happy. The Kowalskis and the Hupfers had come in together, Mrs. Hupfer and Mrs. Kowalski giggling and in their stocking feet, since you can't dance in high heels. And Meryl Lee. Everyone was laughing and jostling to their places. I needed to go find mine. L'chaim, I said to Mrs. Baker. And she smiled. Not a teacher smile. Chrysanthemum, she said. Boy, I hope you remember what they were talking about earlier in the story when they were talking about azalea and chrysanthemum, because it's a really big tie together at the end. So go on back, and it was when Mrs. Baker was going to be was being observed, and they came up with code words. 11 days later, on Wednesday, Lieutenant Tybalt Baker came home. It was the day that President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that the Marines were abandoning Quezon. I was at the airport, me and Danny and my tea and Marilee and Doug and the whole class. Standing on the tarmac when the military plane landed, we all held boxes of sweet strawberries. I guess you want to know what Mrs. Baker did when Lieutenant Baker came out of the plane. And I guess you want to know what Lieutenant Baker did when he saw Mrs. Baker on the tarmac. But toads, beetles, bats. If you can't figure that out for yourself, then a southwest blow on ye and blister you all over. Because let me tell you, it was a happy ending. So, truth. What you don't know is that this is the second time I've read this today. The first time I read it, there was a phone call halfway through, and what I didn't realize is that my camera shut off. So, about 30 minutes ago, I was sitting here sobbing the same way I am now. Good books, great books, amazing books, reach into your soul. And this one has done that for me since it was written 15 years ago. Every time I read this book, I have the same reaction. I don't know if I see myself in Halling or if I just, as a teacher, see myself in Miss Baker, or maybe a little bit of both. But at the beginning of the year, I told you to be good readers. You had to read. And now here's where the depth comes in. To be great readers, you have to find something of yourself in everything that you read, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. If it's fiction, you have to find a character that resonates for you, that means something to you. And maybe it's someone that reminds you of yourself, or maybe it's someone who reminds you of someone who you want to be, or maybe it's someone who reminds you of someone you don't want to be. But the minute you make that connection, the book means something. Like Danny Hupfer, it gains weight. In a nonfiction book, you find your place in that book. What's the story they're telling? How do you fit in it? What can you learn from it? Good books should always make you laugh. Should always make you cry. Should always make you feel. They are the reactions. They're the mood of hobbies. So please, all of you, give yourself permission to laugh, to cry, and don't be shy about it. That's why I'm all out here getting dusty all the time with books that I love. So, I hope you loved it as much as I did. I can't believe we have to read another one. But we get to read another one. So we move on to the next. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks for reading with me The Wednesday Wars. Please subscribe. I've got a few other books already online and I plan to read more. Just let me know what you want me to read. All right, we'll see you later. Peace.
And I'm waiting for Wednesday to show you goodbye. To show you goodbye.